Welcome back. Chapter 7. Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin, it's flown away." And so it had, right out of sight. "Now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look as much as to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh, look," said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving among the trees, over there to the left." They all stared as hard as they could. No one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind that tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "But whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan. And then, though nobody said it out loud, everyone realised the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of an animal," said Susan. And then, look, quick! There it is." They all saw it this time, a whiskered, furry face which looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against its mouth, the way humans put their fingers on their lips when they're signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood, holding their breaths. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind a tree, glanced all around as if it were afraid someone was watching, said, "Hush," and made signs for them to join it thicker in the woods where it was standing. And then once more it disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw its tail." "Well, it wants us to go to it," said Susan, "and it's warning us not to make a noise." "I know," said Peter, "but the question is, are we to go to it or not? What do you think, Lou?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yeah, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Well, shan't we just have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped his head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to them. "Come on," said Peter, "let's give it a try. We'll keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be the enemy." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found a beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in, come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met with the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot, because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve?" it said. "Well, we're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not even safe here." "Why? Who are you afraid of?" asked Peter. "There's no one here but us." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her, you know what I mean." And he nodded his head several times. "If it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you're a friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver," said Peter, "but we are strangers." Quite right," said the beaver. "Here's my token." And with these words, it held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise, till suddenly Lucy said, "Of course, it's my hanky. It's the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Now follow me." Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed it over to me. He said if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on to... Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave 1 or 2 very mysterious looks. Then signalled to the children to stand as close round it as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers. It added in a low whisper, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed." And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken those words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps It has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it has some enormous meaning. Either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life, and you're always wishing you could get back into that dream again. Well, it was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in his insides. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got that feeling that you have when you wake up on the first morning of the school holidays, at the beginning of summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh," said the Beaver. "Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk. And some dinner." No one now, except Edmund, felt any real difficulty about trusting the Beaver, and everyone, including Edmund, were very glad to hear the word dinner. Therefore, they all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry, when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later, they came out in the open sky, the sun was just shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, well, at least it would have been running if it weren't frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers build dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a kind of a modest sort of expression on his face. The sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam." And Mr. Beaver didn't say, "Hush," this time, but merely a trifle. Merely a trifle. "It isn't really finished." Above the dam, there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came, and where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from a hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river, there was another small river, which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that little valley, Edmund could see two small hills, which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamppost the other day. And then between them he thought it must be, he saw her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king, and I wonder how Peter liked that. And horrible ideas came into his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, "and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful, don't slip." The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not, for humans, a very nice place to walk, because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they'd reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed when she went in was a burring sound. And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at a sewing machine, and it was from this the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled paws. At last, to think that I should ever see the day. The potatoes are all boiling, the kettle is singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish. That I will, said Mr. Beaver, and went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice to a deep pool, where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail, a bucket, between them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly, looked hard into it, and then suddenly shot in his paw. And before you could say Jack Robinson, he whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again, until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver fill the kettle, lay the table, cut the bread, put the plate in the oven to heat, and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel, which stood in one corner of the house, and put on the frying pan and get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it wasn't at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds there were bugs like on board a ship built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the walls were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying water in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks, and the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can just think how good they were. New caught fish, smelling beautiful as they fried in the pan, and how hungry the children longed for them to be done, and how much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're very nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver's very own special rocking chair, right by the fire. And they were preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a big jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to his beaver, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as they wanted to go with their potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it's been alive not half an hour ago and has come off the pan not half a minute ago. And when they'd finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly from the oven a gloriously sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire so that when they'd finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured. And when each person got his or her cup of tea, and each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment. "Now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and glowing nicely, why, now we can get down to business. Snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors. And if anyone should have been trying to follow you, they won't see any